And, you know, all these kids, they come into the university with a veneer of cynicism. And it's this deep because they're only 18, they're 19. There's no cynicism there at all. And then that cynicism is fed, and they get more cynical and angry because, well, they came to the place of wisdom and were turned away with more cynicism. Now, I was going to tell you guys, I talked to Yeonmi Park, and I posted this video the other day, and she's a defector from North Korea, and we went through her story. And she wrote this book called In Order to Live, which is a harrowing book, although I don't think it's as harrowing to read as it is harrowing to talk to her. But in any case, her book ends in 2016. So I asked her, what did she do after 2016? And she went through high school and university in South Korea, high school and all the primary school in 1 year, locked herself in a room basically and went through it all in 1 year, and then went to a South Korean university. And they're hard, South Korean universities. And then after she wrote her book, which was inspired, by the way, by George Orwell's Animal Farm, it was very interesting, she went to Columbia to take a humanities degree. And I thought, well, what a remarkable story. This girl escapes from starvation and famine and cruelty and totalitarianism in North Korea, slavery in China, makes her way to New York and goes to Columbia University. She said it was the dream of her father that she be educated. And I said, how was it? She said it was a total waste of time and money. And I said, it shocked me. It really shocked me, because we just had a talk about the ennobling possibility of literature, let's say, with regard to Orwell. And I said, it was the only time in the whole conversation that I actually saw her cynical, which is really something to say given what she'd been through. I said, that can't be right. That can't be right. Like, surely there was one professor, there was one course that led you down the road of the perennial philosophy, let's say, or that held up that golden thread. And she thought, she said, well, I took a human biology course, I learned about evolution, but it got politically correct near the end. And that was it. She couldn't say one thing about it. And so, well, if that's what young people are receiving when they go to an august institution like that, it's no bloody wonder their cynicism is redoubled, especially when that's what's taught to them. We're all power-mad oppressors and despoilers of the planet, and then avatars of our group power. It's like, how could you come out of that anyway but entirely dispirited and also angry?
Well, I've got to say, just speaking in defense of my own students, or at least the system as I've experienced it, my students have been, quite extraordinary and very, very promising, and they seem to have not really picked up any of these kind of ideological pathologies. But I think we, at the same time, do have to sit back and look at the problem more widely. And Nigel and I have spoken about this an awful lot in the last few years through his experiences in Oxford and similar experiences here in Cambridge, that there does seem to be a crisis of the university in the West, a sense of, you might call it an identity crisis, a sense that we can't any longer answer the question, what are universities for? There's one traditional way of thinking about that, and that is to say, roughly speaking, they're for the pursuit of truth and goodness and beauty, and it's going to be chaotic and messy. But then there are competing visions as to what the university is for. We can certainly talk about the perennial philosophy. I mean, that just seems to me to be self-evident, is we're having a conversation down the generations about the nature of humanity and its ideal, and that's what the university is there to foster. So the humanities are at the core, and then it branches out into science and the professions, but that's the heart. And the heart is this discussion, the perennial philosophy. And it does, I can't understand really why that case isn't made more explicitly, and also in some sense somewhat self-evident. I mean, I presume that I can't understand why we're so weak in the face of this criticism. It's like, what the hell's wrong with us? Is it because we're called to be explicit about things that we don't know how to be explicit about? You know, we're taken aback by the critique in some sense. I think part of the problem, Jordan, might be just a structural one, that the university is no longer a university but much more a multiversity, and that we are, as it were, increasingly fragmented, sometimes for very good reasons, into increasingly specialized silos, often even within the same overarching discipline. And one of the things I love working, one of the reasons I love working in a divinity faculty is that it does, as it were, have a single, roughly speaking anyway, a single organizing horizon. And so that I can have colleagues who are sociologists or anthropologists, they work in Eastern religions. I'm a philosopher, but there are theologians, historians, textual specialists, and so on. Roughly speaking, we're part of a single ecosystem, but that is not the case elsewhere. And so there's a kind of fragmentation that makes it very, very difficult to have the sorts of conversations that we've been having.
It's a Tower of Babel, right?
Cacophony
Everybody's
of
speaking
voices
different
and
languages. Yeah.
perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happens after that? That's the flood.
It's not been my experience among my humanities colleagues that what they think they're about are the kinds of deep existential questions that the perennial philosophy raises. I think a lot of them have lost sight of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, certainly when I studied history here in the 1970s, most of it was mind-boring. It was soul-destroying. It was really tedious because apart from the few courses where actually moral questions were raised, or even religious ones, it wasn't really clear what the point of this stuff was.
I mean, if I can say so, Nigel, I think we have a special responsibility as theologians, or those who work within theology, which used to be, of course, the queen of the sciences. The idea being that it was a discipline, not so much a discipline, but a kind of ecosystem of different disciplines that did at least have some story to tell about how all the different avenues of human inquiry could fit together and what place they might have. Now, even if that's completely wrong, it as it were, what would be required to displace that integrated system would be a rival integrated system that was at least comparable in terms of explanatory power and capacity to accommodate all these different different approaches.
Well, so in some sense, your claim, I think, is that if that unitary principle is lacking, and we talked about the unitary principle as the spirit that engenders the perennial philosophy, if that unitary spirit is fragmented and lacking, then something corrupt comes in to fill the void, or something partial, or something limping and crippled in some sense, right? A pathologized religion. And then that, of course, leads to the question, well, how do you know when a religion is pathologized and when it's not? But we got there to some degree there today. We say, well, part of the hallmark of a religion that's got its act together in some sense is that it locates evil within rather than without. And that's an interesting proposition, and seems at least worthy of consideration.
And that's important because it generates humility and therefore generates a certain restraint in the way you treat other people you disagree with. If you don't have that, you can't have a liberal space. You have people shouting at each other. So I think that's really, really important. I mean,
and maybe part of it too is the Socratic insistence upon ignorance. It's like, I'm fundamentally ignorant and prone to malevolence. Fix me, right? Yeah. It's something like that.
Yes.
And I mean, who would argue with that?
Well, Socrates might argue with it. I mean, Socrates, he does think that knowledge is key, that ignorance is the awareness of our epistemic finitude is crucial. He thinks malevolence and wrongdoing is just a failure of knowledge, so that, as it were, moral failure is a kind of cognitive failure, or it's an epistemic failure. And I mean, Aristotle can't handle that at all. He thinks that there's actually something deep within us that leads us to go wrong. But yes, I mean, that Socratic idea, the Socratic principle of dialectical diversity, that is to say, of kind of fruitful friction between two or more positions. I think that model, which is at the heart of the Oxford and Cambridge model, that is to say, broadly, we do have lectures and we do have seminars for graduate students, but that sort of the idea of a tutor in a room, a supervisor with 1, 2, possibly 3 students and, as it were, modeling that kind of dialogical, collaborative inquiry into the truth is
Yeah, well, that's what we're doing right
vital.
now, hopefully. Right, and you, like I said, it's very difficult to overstate the audience hunger for that. It's especially when it's working. I mean, people are drawn to it and pleased, very pleased that it's happening. And there's public demand for it. I mean, when I talked, you know this, when I talked to Harris in Dublin and London, we had like 8,000 and 10,000 people, and it was a good faith conversation, you know, and when we asked the audience if they wanted to switch to Q&A or continue the dialogue, they were overwhelmingly in support of continuing the dialogue. And we've underestimated public intelligence, partly because of technological shortcoming, I think, is that there's a hunger for this, and it's being fed by ideologies. If it isn't fed properly, it's fed by ideologies. And I don't know what to make of the ignorance versus malevolence idea. You know, I mean, it's a little of column A and a little of column B, because I do see the delight. Like, let me tell you a quick story. So you tell me if you think this is ignorance or malevolence. So when I debated Slavoj Žižek, I did a 15-minute critique of the Communist Manifesto, and there were a lot of radical leftists in the audience, and they'd come to hear Žižek, you know, take me apart, although that isn't what happened in the discussion. We just had a discussion. And I mentioned at one point that the Communist Manifesto was an incitement to bloody violence and mayhem. And like a fifth of the audience laughed and cheered. And it was that Freudian revelation of unconscious motivation. You know, they're all individuals in the crowd, so they're masked. They can manifest their darkest motivations without fear of revelation. And it just stopped me cold for about 10 seconds. And I thought, yeah, no kidding. It's like, we'll go dance in the streets when things are burning. And is that towards some higher good, or is it just, it's about time those bastards got what they deserved? And it isn't obvious to me that that's a manifestation of the striving for higher good. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because if you identify evil, in some sense, you have an obligation to deal with it. But then if you don't identify the evil that's within and you externalize it, your motives are suspect right away, because it's just too convenient. And you might say, well, that's ignorance. And I do think that's part of it. But the convenience factor is, it can't be overlooked. Like, first of all, your moral obligation is only to persecute those who are evil. So that lifts a huge weight off your shoulders. And then you get to do anything terrible you want, because you've identified the adversary himself and it's not you. And if that's ignorance, it's so deep that it transforms itself at that point into a kind of willfully blind malevolence. That's how it looks to me.